Welcome back to the NASA Citizen Science Community Workshop Series. I'm your host, Sarah Kirn from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Once again, we'll start with reminders. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves if you've not done so already. And if you find that chat distracting, close it or move it aside. Note that the chat default is to send your chats to panelists only. When you write a chat note, use the blue box just above where you type to redirect your comments where you want them to go. Please use the Q&A tool, which you'll find in the footer next to the chat tool, to submit questions for our panelists. You can now vote questions up in the Q&A tool and comment on them. If a question seems to vanish, look at the top of the Q&A window for the tabs to access answered questions. It's probably there. Thanks to all of you who joined us last time for our panel on new technology and citizen science. Once again, we had a great group of panelists, each of whom brought forward a different perspective on our topic. We had a flurry of terrific questions from you, our audience members, and once again, the conversation lingered well after our official close. If you aren't sticking with us until the very, very end, you are missing out on some wonderful exchanges and broad-ranging conversation. Last time, we ended with a discussion about how humans and computer algorithms can be used together to uncover bias in each. I continue to be humbled by the remarkable minds who have been part of this series. Dr. Heather Fischer, our new technology and citizen science panel host, has agreed to come back to reflect with me on the conversation that we had last time. So Heather, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I love the reflection that we do 2 weeks after the previous panel, and it was such a great panel on new technology and citizen science, and that's such an enormous topic. There's so much we could have talked about. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think is particularly important, just to remind our audience of, or to launch thinking around it?
Yeah, we scratched the surface on a few topics that I think are really important themes throughout this whole webinar series. And one of them is the issue of equity and accessibility in citizen science. And technology definitely creates some of those issues. I know we scratched the surface of it. Holly mentioned Globe Observer and how it was created as a way to take the Globe program, which is a K-12 formal education program, very kind of paper-based observations, to a wider public mobile app, but recognizing that we're missing out on some different people, different demographics of people, age, ethnicity, and things like that. And not even just in the United States, but kind of across the globe. You know, not everybody has access to great cell phone service so they could download and use the app and make observations. And we also need to recognize that in like internet-based, kind of website-based programs like Zooniverse or NemoNet or something like that, where people don't have the best bandwidth sometimes to, use some of those programs and things like that. And who are we leaving out when we're really focused on the program being very tech heavy? And who are the folks that aren't, being able to use the program, don't have access to it because we're being so heavy on the personal technology.
With that one, it occurs to me that that one slices both ways, as do so many of the issues that we talked about, that now that some citizen science projects are really tech heavy, where they may appeal to a whole new group of people who might not have been interested in going and looking for bugs outside, but they're really interested in doing something with their cell phone or computer or accessing data that they wouldn't have otherwise had access to. So that slices both ways.
Right. You might be attracting a different group of people, but you might be leaving out this other group, and just making conscious decisions as a citizen science program who you are focusing on recruiting and who you're actively going to say, you know what, for our project, we aren't focusing on this group, but making sure that as a collective citizen science community, that somebody is accessible, some project over there is accessible to this group and that group, and making sure that collectively we're reaching the broadest audience possible.
Absolutely. So one of the other technology ideas that you've mentioned before is this connection between technology used in support of citizen science and learning around citizen science, and technology in support of formal education. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we touched a little bit on EdTech, education technology, but most of the conversation last time was really focused on how people are collecting the data and doing the science part of a citizen science program, and less on how the technology is helping them learn. I know we kind of scratched the surface on that, but that's right for a whole nother webinar focused solely on education technology and the intersection with citizen science. And we see that in the NemoNet project that we highlighted last time. They have a great kind of training that includes some kind of interactive feedback and some ed tech ideas in it to help first train the volunteers to then go out and use the game and identify coral. So we see some ed tech represented in citizen science, but I know there's a lot more interesting things going on, even in NASA, that I think we can kind of come together a little more and integrate more ed technology into the citizen science programs. And I think that'll help with training the volunteers to produce better data, but then also will help them with getting feedback and learning more and be more satisfied with being a participant in the project.
Yeah, all of which can lead to much better science, because you've got volunteers who are kind of up to date on their skills and have practiced and are really adept at what's being asked of them. But it can also be really motivating and fun to get better and better at something, and getting some feedback can really move people along. Right. Absolutely. Anything else we missed from last time that you want to touch on?
Oh gosh, we could probably talk about so many different things. Along the lines of ed tech, I think thinking about embedded assessments specifically and that's that feedback part and how to integrate that into your mobile app program. And I know that Zooniverse does some of this and other projects, but kind of thinking about how can we get feedback from the volunteers about how we're doing, but also give them feedback of like, you're doing a great job in embedding that into the program itself, instead of having to send out a survey and things like that, how to really get that feedback embedded into the program so it's seamless.
Yeah, and that is a really exciting technology and set of ideas that are coming along. And it's also a great segue to our panel today, which is focusing on evaluation and using some new tools and strategies for evaluating what is happening in our projects and what isn't. Heather, thank you so much for joining me again. We have a great panel discussion teed up for you today. I hope you'll find it both provocative and useful. And I know that our panelists are eager for your questions, so don't hold back. Today's panel has been convened by Dr. Jennifer Shirk, who you may recognize as the host of our panel on COVID and other crises, strategies for rapid response citizen science that we had back in June. You may also recognize Jennifer as the voice and face of the Citizen Science Association. Jennifer is a scholar, a participant, and most of all, a true champion of citizen science. And as a consequence, she may have the most extensive network of citizen science professionals of anyone I know. We all get to meet a few of her contacts today. Jennifer, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. I know one of the reasons we wanted to almost close out this series with this particular panel was to take a chance to reflect on what citizen science is accomplishing, and also how we can capture and celebrate some of those accomplishments. We all know that one of the hallmarks of NASA citizen science is emphasizing the successes of science and the scientific outcomes and discoveries. We're really good at tracking those discoveries in the form of publications and reports and data. Today, instead of focusing on the science, we wanted to focus on the parallel goals for NASA citizen science in looking at what participants gain from taking part. And there are so many ways that we could think about why people do citizen science and what any one of us might get out of a project that we choose to take part in. NASA's policies for citizen science really give us a starting point for this conversation, and they frame up goals around informing a scientifically literate public. And some of the grant calls even get more specific. The science activation grants talk about specifically, and here I'm quoting, public understanding of the process of NASA science. And so these are really great goals, but once we start to set out to meet them, we can pretty quickly bump up against big questions. So what do these things actually mean? Particularly understanding scientific processes. How does that relate to our participants' experiences or to the science we're trying to produce? How do we set out to make these things possible? And then how do we know if we're making any kind of a difference? So today's panel really brings together three folks who are really well situated to help us dig into these big questions and to think about the design and then the evaluation of citizen science projects from the perspective of participant outcomes. So the experts we've convened today are 3 PhDs, Doctors Martin Storksdieck, Tina Phillips, and Liz MacDonald. I'm going to give them each a chance to introduce themselves by sharing their perspectives on some of these questions. And I'm going to start with Martin. So Martin, Dr. Martin Storksdieck, is director of the STEM Research Center at Oregon State University. He's formerly director of the Board on Science Education at the National Academies. And he's collaborated on several NASA projects, including a recent Globe Citizen Science Needs Assessment. I was really intrigued in reading Martin's bio online that the STEM Research Center has a focus not just on researching people's interest in science, but their interest in learning about science. So Martin is really grounded in what learning means and the different ways that we can talk about learning. So Martin, can you help set the stage for us and for this conversation from your familiarity with the field and with NASA about what we're even talking about in regards to learning and understanding the process of science?
Yeah, happy to do that. Happy to be on this panel. It's an honor to speak to all of you about these issues. I think they're very important. And thank you for letting me kick this off with some reflections on that. I think you've already framed it a little bit by saying many outcomes are possible in citizen science that we're not talking about, including something we are currently also researching, which is the tension between productivity in terms of research outputs and ways in which we can guarantee that data that come from citizen science have high quality and linking that to the skills people develop. Which brings us to the idea of what would people learn about the process of science. And I think this has multiple dimensions, what they could learn. Part of that is indeed understanding broadly how the scientific enterprise works and how does research gets done. This is more of an awareness and understanding component of an outcome for participants in citizen science, particularly NASA ones, whereby they understand what it takes to do research. What are the components of research? How is research being organized? How is it self-corrective when it gets published? And all these components could potentially be touched on when you take part in a citizen science project. The second part of the process of science links to an element that is oftentimes described now in the new science education standards and have to do with aid science and engineering practices. So part of understanding the process of science is getting better at some of those, both in terms of the skills you develop in doing them, as well as feeling that you are part of it. Something else that the National Academies, in a former book on learning science in informal environments, had described as authentically taking part in science processes. And that is to understand what it means to ask good scientific questions, thoroughly investigate them, being part of the process of collecting or analyzing data and interpreting those. And of course, depending on what the nature of the citizen science project is, you may touch on one of these, on multiple of them, and you may actually require that people get better at this, develop skills around these in order to have high quality data. And what we know from the learning sciences is that nothing happens unless you reflect. So no outcome is possible unless it's incidental if you do not enforce it in some ways, reinforce it by allowing people to reflect on the skills and on the knowledge they're developing. And that is an important message that I want to send. It doesn't just happen. And that's maybe where I want to stop at this point.
Great, thanks so much, Martin. It's a really good reminder as we get into this, that part of what we're thinking about is not just what we're doing, but how we're doing it, not taking for granted that these things can happen. That's a point that really has been viscerally introduced to and reinforced to me by our next panelist, Dr. Tina Phillips, who I had the honor to work with for, I think, probably at least 15 years at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. She is now the assistant director there of the Lab of O's Center for Engagement in Science and Nature. She is a board member with the Citizen Science Association, where I am now based. And among many other affiliations, she's one of the authors of the National Academies consensus study on learning through citizen science and enhancing opportunities by design. This idea of design being central to the concept of evaluation, which is where I often talk about her skill set being focused, and where I'm going to ask her to start this conversation here, because I think of her as an expert evaluator, and I know she will remind us that evaluation starts with thoughtful design, so we don't take things for granted. But Tina, I wanted to give you a chance to expand on what Martin has said here, because part of your work in evaluation has been looking at how we break down an understanding of evaluation in order to better be able to measure the outcomes. And I wanted to ask you to share some of the constructs that you use to understand science learning, or public understanding of science, however you prefer to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you to NASA and the rest of the panelists. I'm honored to be here today. These NASA convenings have been really fascinating and fun to be an attendee on. So way back when in 2009, we started looking at the field of citizen science in terms of trying to understand the outcomes that were being talked about and published regarding the participants themselves. So not necessarily the scientific outcomes, which at that time were really starting to ramp up and be shown in the literature. So we looked at what was happening across the field and found that evaluation at that point was quite scattered and disparate. And even though there were projects looking at very similar constructs like knowledge of science or interest in science, everyone was measuring them quite differently. And in order to really move the field forward, to be able to say, hey, the field is really having an impact on these things, a group of us wrote an NSF grant, which was awarded. It was called Devise. And from that early work, we developed a framework that really just not exhaustively, but comprehensively examined various common outcomes that we had heard through interactions, experiences, and empirical data that we collected from citizen science project leaders about the most common outcomes that they were interested in measuring. And so it turned out that this framework, which I have a slide for, was basically focused on interest in science and the environment, efficacy for science and environmental action, motivation for science learning and doing as well as environmental action, skills related to science inquiry, much of what Martin was describing in the scientific practices, the knowledge of the nature of science and how knowledge is produced. I think that was what Martin referred to as how scientific enterprise works, so very analogous to that idea. And then environmental stewardship. And a lot of the work was centered on this sort of duality of outcomes related to not only science in general, but also the environment, because so many citizen science projects do have an environmental focus. And so we developed the framework, but then we also developed some very easy to use tools and measures that some of which could be customized to a particular project and used pretty easily right off the shelf in the kinds of informal settings that most citizen science takes place in. And I would say that we are starting to build a knowledge base just with respect to these tools in terms of the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing in citizen science. And we were able to create a dozen or so tools. The one tool we were not able to create was the one on the nature of science, which ends up, which proved to be the most challenging to validate and create a measure for. And I suspect we'll get into some of the rationale for why that particular outcome is challenging.
Thanks, Tina, and thanks for really opening up some of the different details that we can think about in relationship to learning and understanding scientific processes. I want to turn now to Dr. Liz MacDonald, who is maybe able to put some of that into the picture of a NASA project. Liz is really well known to the NASA community, to many in the NSF community, for the work that she's done on scientific and engagement successes of her award-winning project, Aurorasaurus. And Liz works through Aurorasaurus and other efforts to study how the northern lights are born and how they evolve with a combination of heliophysics data from satellites and on the ground. And I love just the poetics of how that's even expressed. I noticed in Liz's Twitter bio that she's also a poet at heart. She really has shown exemplary engagement of her community, both with her volunteers and on Twitter. And they've done a lot of work through her project, and she and her team have been recognized by NASA for exceptional achievements in science. I did want to mention that Liz is a scientist, and she's doing heliophysics work. And we've asked her here as a scientist to talk about how adding on to that expertise and the work of doing that science, what it really means and looks like to also have goals for influencing the public understanding. So Liz, can I ask you to share some of your thoughts and your perspectives to really be looking at these goals, what it means in Aurorasaurus or within NASA to strive for helping the public to understand the process of science?
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm excited to be here, and I am really just a scientist on this panel. And when I started the project 8 years ago, I didn't even know what citizen science was. I didn't know what the field of human-computer interactions was. I'm not sure I knew what the field of theory of knowledge and all of these are new concepts to me. So where I was coming from was the opportunities to get more data and to serve people who are interested in seeing the aurora by connecting them faster with citizen science and tools that we have, smartphones and all that. So we have really, it's been very interesting. We have had one major discovery that our project has been a key part of with citizen scientists. And the way that came about was citizen scientists asking the question about what did they see? And there really wasn't a good answer. What they saw was something called Steve that was not recognized in the scientific literature. And so that has led to a lot of insights about the process of science, I would say, because the story has gone viral and many people have heard about this, that there's new discoveries in this field and the role that citizen scientists can play and be rewarded for and lead to increasing their motivation to contribute. But it's reflecting on this, it's also very interesting because it's really about asking the question. Science doesn't have all of the answers, and it's it's a group process, and so we are still looking to engage citizen scientists and very much in, I would say, an experimental mode on that, as far as how we advance learning in our project. For instance, we're reading journal articles with citizen scientists and increasing confidence in understanding the concepts that are often really arcane and not taught in school, really. So that's just a starting point. And we have, we can get more into it, but I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Liz. And actually, I'm going to take that as an opportunity to leap all the way back to where Martin gave us a jumping off point at the beginning to say, let's reground this in the goals of NASA science. And NASA does have these two goals for science and for scientifically literate public and advancing understandings of the processes. But how do those two things relate? How can we anchor this opportunity to advance public learning, individual learning, back in that big goal of producing really good science? How does this matter? Martin, would you like to take that to start?
Sure. And I want to start this by saying that when you think about the idea of a connection between doing research and creating awareness and understanding of what it means to do research and learning about the research topic, it's sometimes useful to look back and how are we doing this with undergrads and graduate students? And to understand that when we do that, interestingly enough, in contrast to many citizen science projects, we actually support their reflection on what it is that they do, because we find it very important that they learn specifically as part of a research project what it means to do this research. And I'm saying this only insofar as I just want to stress again how difficult it is to let this just happen. And the other thing I wanted to mention, that is because of NASA covering some component of it. And Tina mentioning beforehand that in her device framework, she had environmental stewardship in it. And this brings me to also reflect briefly on the idea that it's the National Academy of Sciences. People have been criticizing this and said, why didn't you say in your renaming of the National Academies that you are the National Academy of Sciences rather than the National Academy of Science? And I think that came from a reflection that science is not a monolithic component of society. It's not an enterprise and a part of our societal efforts that can be reduced to simple formulas of what it is and what it does. There's a whole scientific discipline of studying science itself. I would also call myself, by the way, a scientist. In this said, I don't study natural phenomenon in the physical world. I study Homo sapiens, and I study Homo sapiens in a particular way, particularly around the way in which Homo sapiens interacts with each other and the environment by learning. But that doesn't make me not a scientist. And that I'm mentioning this only insofar as it is important for us to recognize that and that goes back to when Tina was saying how difficult it is to measure the nature of science, understanding of nature of science and other things, that we are struggling with this because the concept underlying it is so difficult to grasp. And that's so difficult to grasp because it's complex. And what we oftentimes try to do when we try to let people know what the nature of science is, we try to make it simple. And in trying to make it simple, we begin to disagree because different forms of science are not in agreement about what the nature of science is and even what the processes of science is. We agree on some very high level about what science does and how science as an enterprise is different from other forms of generating knowledge or knowing about things. But beyond that, where we have that agreement, and it's great, it has to do with the self-correction, it's to do with the idea of being driven by evidence and not by beliefs and so on and so forth. It's about these kinds of forms. But beyond that, it becomes really difficult to say what precisely is it that we are talking about. That goes back to NASA science now. When we're now doing this, maybe part of thinking about this is to reduce our appetite for saying what it is that we mean by this, and be very specific about a few just indicator ideas around what it is we want people to take away from these experiences. And one can certainly have a much more pronounced discussion about what these are.
Thanks, Martin. Liz, I'd love to ask your thoughts on that in the context of your project. And Tina, I have another question queued up for you to follow. But Liz, how do these two things relate in Aurorasaurus, for example?
Well, I resonate with that definitely, and everyone everyone is doing science in contributing, but it's the learners, like people are engaging in all different levels, and it's almost choose your own adventure, and that's part of what's so powerful about it, it seems, and also part of what's so difficult to measure. And so I have lots of anecdotal evidence of people asking questions, deepening their inquiry, going from astrophotographer to a science major and beyond, and really engaged through the process, or adults going from, just going outside and taking photos to reading papers, and connecting what they're seeing to more of the process or more of the knowledge in the field. But yeah, it's a really rich, interesting area, and there's lots of opportunities there.
Thanks, Liz. And because it's so rich, and because there are so many opportunities, and because it's so complex, that makes it even more difficult as a project designer, and especially if you're setting yourself up to evaluate something and say, I have moved the needle, for example, on helping people learn, to articulate a goal, right? And to say, we're going to focus on this and we're going to design for this. And Tina, this is where I wanted to turn to you and say, how do you cut through that? If you were working with someone who came to you and said, hey, I really want to affect public learning and knowledge, participant knowledge through my project, how do you help them get started to even identify a goal, let alone work towards a measurable outcome?
Well, first, I just would love to just agree with Martin on the reflection and the explicitity piece that is so pivotal. I think when citizen science really started to be formalized a couple of decades ago, there was this underlying assumption that sort of like, if we build it, they will come and they will learn science and they will understand how science happens. There's a lot of evidence against that now. And what we're learning and what we write about in that National Academies book, Designing for Learning, is that there needs to be a lot of scaffolding in place, facilitation, scaffolding, reflection, to really make these concepts about how knowledge advances and how science and research are undertaken over time, over centuries, really, that there needs to be this real hand-holding, no matter the age, whether you're in middle school or whether you're in your 80s. And so it's just not implicit like we thought. It has to be really explicit. So I just wanted to sort of underscore that because I think it's super important. For the project leader that says, I want to engage participants in the process of science learning, I would ask them first, how they think about it and what it means to them. We know that citizen science is really good at influencing content knowledge. So if you're running a project about butterflies, there is almost 100% guarantee that your participants are going to learn all sorts of ecological principles about butterflies, which is great. They will probably pick up a lot of tools and practices of science along the way too, when they're collecting data and understanding why we're following protocols and things are standardized in such a way. So citizen science is really good at content knowledge, at skills. We're starting to see evidence that efficacy, that people's confidence in their ability to be engaged and be a thoughtful, productive contributor to science is also an outcome that we're seeing more and more of. And motivation, that motivation is really key, and we can talk a little bit more about that if we have time. But the nature of science, the sort of epistemology of how knowledge happens, or the sort of process of science, that's the one that we see far less evidence of in the citizen science field. Not many people have tried to measure it, but the articles that have tried have shown that they just didn't see, they've seen attitude shifts in how people think about science or their appreciation for science, but not necessarily advances in their understanding of the process of science. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. I don't think that it's out of the realm of what citizen science can do and achieve, but we need better scaffolding, facilitation, and reflection activities that can help project leaders build that infrastructure and support for their projects and participants.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to echo some of the things that I'm hearing from you there, that you're looking for the design of things to intentionally support the learning, reflection being one of those things. I'm also hearing from you that this goal that is part of NASA's DNA at this point in terms of what NASA projects are set up to strive for is a particularly challenging one in the whole landscape of the types of learning that could be affected through citizen science. I want to come back to some of the scaffolding and reflection tools, but I wanted to use that jumping off point to turn to Martin right now and say, okay, so this public understanding of science, I know you have looked at learning and learning assessments of NASA projects, GLOBE being one. What do you see that is working towards that direction, or where are there opportunities related to the understanding of science and the processes of science within NASA projects where you think there are some highlights or some things that we can be thinking about towards that end?
Let me start this by saying, if you want a project to provide what Tina was talking about, this is epistemology, the broader process of science, the nature of science, this bigger picture perspective, you have to do it with a project that does that. So not every project can accomplish all things. So in order to have people have a bigger understanding, a broader understanding of what the scientific enterprise is about, how science is being done, what are the steps of it, it would have to be a project that involves people in these steps necessarily as part of their performance, meaning as part of what they do. I want to go back, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but the nature of the citizen science projects is that they do things. And what they do is the core of their experience and the core of what they would be learning. Of course, as Tina and I was stressing, you gotta have to help them reflect on this. But you can't have them reflect on something they're not doing. So that brings up the question, what NASA project provides a fertile ground such that someone would have a fighting chance to understand the broader sense of the nature of science or the process of science? That is my first limitation that I want to bring out here. So you got to be clear that the nature of the task itself, the nature of the project, needs to link to a chance of getting to that outcome. That said, let me reflect a little bit on what we're doing with Globe Observer. Here we are charged, so this is a project that is a spin-off of Globe for those who are not too familiar with it, but it now allows non-students and teachers to engage in it. And it's facilitated through an app, and there are multiple ways in which you can do this. Let's say easy one would be cloud observation. You can go outside, observe clouds, identify them, and photograph them and let people know here is, and feed it in. Quick one. The part about the, let's say, nature or skills of science that I'm particularly interested in here as an evaluator and researcher is the linkage between, can I trust the data, and do people get good at doing what we ask them to do? Now, this is not a very profound idea. I think anybody, this is the golden, this is a holy grail maybe of citizen science, simultaneously optimizing the learning and skill development process of your participants and the metadata on the quality of data you have, such that the researcher can say, this is solid stuff. And the participants can say, this was fun, and I feel, as Tina was saying, my self-confidence in doing this was increasing. This we call self-efficacy, maybe self-confidence. They're developing a sense of moving forward. It is not just a service project I'm doing to fulfill some need, but I enjoy doing it because I see that I do it well. And in our case, what we're trying to do is trying to find out what are the essential characteristics of that skill set that links them to science, that we can simultaneously optimize, measure, and then use as metadata for the quality of the scientific information that comes out of this for the researchers. So in this particular case, we'd like to understand how we can optimize how people look at clouds, how they identify them, and then also bring them to understand that part of the scientific process is not just collecting data, but to make them available. One of the things that's important here is that citizen scientists who are engaging in projects, this was particularly problematic for GLOBE, may be conducting the process of getting the data in, but then didn't submit them. And this seems simple, right? It's a simple thing to say that in this process of not only asking good questions that will lead us to the next level of understanding, devising a process and a methodology to get to that, collecting the data, submitting the data, and potentially verifying the data, and then interpreting what it all means. So in this process, we have chosen a particular niche, a particular component of it that we feel we can do well. We will not be able to say to NASA at the end that GLOBE Observer in this particular instance will have increased people's understanding of the nature of science, but we can say that a component of this broader aspiration that we can pick out as an element that contributes to that, we have very, very thoroughly investigated and have solid data on. And I think when we do this across multiple NASA projects, then we could put it together like a puzzle, rather than have the one project that rules them all, for those of us who are nerdy enough to know what I'm talking about. And that is probably one of the more process-oriented, field-oriented questions that we should ask ourselves is, do we have to have each project show all of it? Or can we put it together in such a way? And I think Tina is leading the way here with some other colleagues she's working on creating a way to think about assessment and evaluation that can be shared amongst projects, such that when somebody does something over here, we can compare it to over there. And while we might not want to pool data, we can then say in a meta-analysis, together it makes sense. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about it. So that's my example for that. But you can do this in each project, depending on the nature of the project, and give your part of the puzzle so that we together can put the piece together.
Thanks. I am going to come back to how we capture that, how we get these puzzle pieces. But I did want to give Liz a chance to weigh in from the perspective of a scientist running one of these projects, the opportunities that you see within a project to make change, to shift the needle here.
What I wanted to say is that one of the exciting things about the new citizen science policy at NASA is, I mean, citizen science projects have all kinds of different sizes and designed for different sizes, but there are opportunities in that policy for projects to be designed within the context of satellite missions, which are like the biggest thing that we do in science at NASA. And so if you embed citizen science projects with a mission over a longer time in the development of that mission with the scientists and engineers and taking data and all of that, I think that there are more opportunities, or that would be a good place and an appropriate place to start with the design and think about how we can demonstrate this in the context of NASA.
Thanks. But before I come back to the point about measuring and capturing these outcomes, I did want to see if there was anyone who wanted to weigh in still on this concept of design and thinking about this intentionally from the outset. Really, who influences this process? And then how do we think about these things if we're designing to affect these outcomes? You've talked, each of you, Tina and Martin in particular, about things like scaffolding and reflection. What would that actually look like within a project? So for example, Liz mentioned reading journal articles together. Is that the kind of thing that would count as reflection, or what other types of activities would support this learning and help enact what you're talking about in terms of not taking it for granted, making sure that some of these things hit home?
One of the things that I always think about with design relevant to citizen science is motivation, and motivation and identity are really important in understanding and designing around. So, for example, if your project is about birds, I do a lot of projects about birds, right? Most of the participants coming into that project are coming in because they have a deep underlying interest in birds. and you can build around that interest, right? And the idea being that no matter what you're studying related to birds, the design should help achieve your scientific goals, obviously, but also allow for the participant to maintain a fun and enjoyable experience. That I would say is number one. As soon as it becomes unenjoyable and not fun, you're going to have people dropping off. But then also designing for aspects of engagement that attend to things like social interactions, right? We know that for some people, coming in with this interest is great, but then their learning and their engagement is heightened because of the social interactions that a project might afford, or building on the skills that they might achieve from participating in data collection, tapping into their emotions, their affective aspects of what drives them to be passionate about something like birds. And even, obviously the learning, the cognitive piece. People love to share their learning, right? They love to tell you what they know. So if you're coming at it with a project that is largely hobby or interest focused, you would design it in a way that really elevates people's capacity to engage and maintain a fun environment. On the other hand, you may be looking at a project that people are coming to because there's injustices in the environment in their communities that they see. There's a risk to them personally. Their water is contaminated. There's certainly interest there, but it's not necessarily born out of a hobby, right? They're coming to your project because they're looking for science to be a voice, for science to give them agency. And you would design a project like that much differently. First of all, you probably might not be designing it. The community might be designing it, right? So it's a much more collaborative kind of process when it's a community generated project that is born out of some risk or some perceived threat. So just understanding where the participant motivations come from, I think is really central to how a project is designed, whether it's designed by the scientist or whether it's designed by the community. And I think all things sort of fall out from that.
And I can add to that maybe, if you want people to understand more of the process, so I want to add to what Tina said, because everything that Tina said is really, really essential here. From the design perspective, if you want to design for people understanding more of the process or the whole arc of science, make it part of your project. Very simple. Give an example. A colleague of mine at the IPN, the Institute for Pedagogy in the Natural Science and Mathematics in Kiel, Germany, developed a citizen science project about wildlife in Berlin. Now, the typical citizen science project of that nature would have people work hard on getting the data in, meaning putting up cameras, or observations, and so on and so forth, maybe identifying the animals. They actually went one step further. They then had a secondary recruitment from the people who do what usually is done in these to a data analysis tool that they developed, so that they crowdsourced the analysis of the results of the data itself. So now you can be part of that component. And that allows you then to potentially study even the next phase, which is the interpretation of all of this. So you're really free to push your citizen science project as far as you wish. And not everybody has to take part in everything. But it is an opportunity for you, as Tina was saying, to even start thinking about what's the nature of the project that I should be doing, what's the research question I should be asking. The person who designs a research project and wants to use citizen science as a mechanism for that, whether that's a researcher or a community member, is completely free to say how far one can go. But these are design decisions right at the start that will create huge constraints on what somebody will later learn from being part of it. And that is really where your imagination is the only limit, and your willingness and ability to involve people in the stages of your research project as far as you want to push it. I think there's a big difference whether you whether you do broader readings around the topic, which is fantastic to do if people are involved and want to do that, to helping or having a group of your citizen scientists co-interpret what the results even mean, and how that goes into the broader discussion about how this project might make contributions to the scientific literature. So I know this is kind of a hard sell probably, but it really is up to the designer of a project to ask how far you want to take this. And that is where all the basic decisions basically are being made about the participant experience, about the degree to which you as a designer of the project has to be involved. This is a lot of commitment. and of course, an easier commitment is to set up a simple data collection or data identification system and leave it at that. And the other parts, the more you want to engage in it, the more it becomes really a bigger project for you, but potentially a more satisfying one, and one in which you can actually indeed involve people in the process of science. And by being involved, they'll learn about the process of science, potentially. So that's my way of saying it really is a question of thinking through the nature of the experience you're providing, and opening your project up to these opportunities if you can, if you have the money, if you have the capacity, and if the nature of the project allows for it.
Thanks, Martin. I really want to give Liz a chance to illustrate that a bit for us, because Liz, I know you've done such thoughtful work in Aurorasaurus, and can you tell us a little bit more about the aha moments for you, or the deliberate choices, or the unexpected choices you found that you've made that have helped connect people to learning, or give you insight into opportunities for learning, things that you've seen happen through your process of building a project within NASA?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've learned by, the first time that you try really interdisciplinary work and you don't know what it is, you're not so good at it. So you get better at it as you go. And I will also say that when I started Aurorasaurus, it was actually with a much larger National Science Foundation, Inspire, innovative interdisciplinary grant. And so we were explicitly working with people in other fields. And in this case, I don't actually think, I think what Martin was just talking about sounds great, but I still personally don't know how to implement that. And I would need people with that expertise in the project. And that would be the best way to go forward, because then we can figure out how to speak the same language, and how the way that I'm looking at it, or what I see as possibilities for what we're measuring matches up with, really we have to dialogue on all of this, and definitely think about the people who are participating as well, and what works for them as well. So I think it's pretty uncommon that we have all the different disciplines and all of the expertise working together. And even here, I would love to learn more about what's been demonstrated in more of the biological fields, because my project is more observational. But, there are different journals, and, this is where, again, the Citizen Science Association is really important, because we can learn from each other. But there are those barriers, and you have to be willing to, get comfortable being uncomfortable, and figure out even where to start and what the words mean. And I'm going to admit that I still don't actually know what you guys mean by reflection. But it's kind of, maybe I do.
Martin or Tina, did one of you want to answer that question before we shift to our audience? What do you mean by reflection, Martin?
It means that when you do a particular task that you think you might be getting better at, let's say very close observation, and you're observing very closely, and that's what you need to do. Many projects have that I now also allow you to think what it means to observe very closely. What are the elements of close observation? What does it mean to get better at observing closely? And that would allow me, and that's what the learning science would suggest, to actually get better at it. You get better by repeating the task and intuitively optimizing towards something, but you're getting better much faster if you know what you're optimizing towards. And reflection is the process of understanding what you're optimizing for. This is the way I think about this. So it is. Tina was talking about scaffolding. You're providing people with, so to say, the framework of what it means in this particular case to be a close observer. And that's basically what it is. It's very, very closely related to just what people learn and to allow people to understand the nature of their learning.
Liz's point there at the very end is it's so essential. Citizen science can't happen without these kinds of cross-disciplinary conversations and the hard work to try to understand each other, because not only is it this back and forth between project leaders and project participants, but the interdisciplinary nature of designing science and learning, let alone other goals that come into the mix, is just so, it adds this layer of complexity that I think so few people appreciate when they set out to do this work. So I just wanted to thank you all for unpacking that a little bit, and Liz for all of the work that you've done within that in your project to engage that and move it forward. Sarah, I know you're moving us towards Q&A from the audience. Anything you want to jump us off with here?
Well, I was going to compliment Liz and compliment you, Jennifer, actually, on creating another component of this that I think is so important to support learning, is creating opportunities and communities, cultures, where people feel free to ask questions. So you've created this wonderful little community among these panelists, and you've made it a welcoming enough place where Liz could ask her question, and Liz took the step and asked the question, and it's opened up a whole new learning for all of us. So I think that's also a good, that's a design element in citizen science projects often. Where do you create opportunities for conversation? So now let's open up our conversation and include our audience.